World at War, Part 2. The United States goes to war. May 1st, 1915, German submarine torpedoes a passenger ship, the Lusitania, killing 1,198 people, of which 128 were Americans, mostly women and children. The Germans did this because even though the Lusitania was a civilian ship, it was secretly carrying ammunition to the Allies. Wilson responds. Americans were outraged, but Wilson wanted to remain neutral. He demanded that Germany apologize, pay money damages, and commit to not using submarines again. Germany agrees to everything except the commitment not to use subs. Wilson tried to use diplomacy to end the war, but at the same time began to prepare for a national defense. Congress did not support this until the following March, when a German sub sank the French passenger ship, as depicted here, the Sussex, killing several passengers. To prevent the U.S. from entering the war, Wilson had Germans agree to the Sussex Pledge, which stated that they promised not to sink merchant ships without warning and without saving human lives. Congress sets up the Council of National Defense to organize industries and resources in case of war. Wilson wins the election of 1916 on the campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war." The United States enters the war. Wilson suggests peace without victory, in which neither side gained territory or lost power, but Europe rejected this idea in January of 1917. The Germans win stunning victories on the Eastern Front against Russians at this time. The Western Front was deadlocked in trench warfare. The Germans then violated the Sussex Pledge. In response, Wilson broke off diplomatic relations and practiced armed neutrality. So we stayed neutral, but we had our military preparing for war. Zimmermann note. British intercepted a coded message from the German Foreign Secretary Zimmermann to the German ambassador to Mexico. It instructed the ambassador to offer Mexico a deal. If Mexico joined Germany in an alliance against the U.S., Germany would restore New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas to Mexico. Wilson made the note public, which caused a surge of anti-German sentiment in the United States. So basically, the Germans reach out to Mexico and said, if you will start a war, if you will join our side, and keep the Americans busy on the North American continent, when we win, we will allow you to take back territory that formerly belonged to Mexico, that is New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. Because basically the Germans were trying to keep the Americans from coming into the war against the Allies. The British, all at the same time, wanted the Americans to come in on the side of the Allies. And so the British actually are the ones who intercept this telegram and then decode it and then make it known to the Americans, because they were hoping that this would increase anti-German sentiment, fire up the Americans, and that the Americans would then come and join the Allies. So it's pretty interesting. At the same time, Germans sank several American merchant ships, so you see things starting to ramp up. This is a picture of Tsar Nicholas II. Revolution in Russia. Tsar Nicholas II was overthrown and a democratic government was set up, making Russia an acceptable ally for the United States. The United States did not want to be allies with a monarchy. But once Tsar Nicholas is overthrown, then Russia suddenly becomes a much more acceptable ally for the United States. And on April 2nd, 1917, Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war. And on April 6th, Congress voted to go to war. The Yanks are coming. On June 14, 1917, Paris greeted the American Expeditionary Forces, led by General John J. Pershing. American and British warships also formed a convoy to guard troop carriers across the Atlantic. The last year of the war, 1917, the Germans remained in control of northern France and Belgium. In the Battle of Caporetto in October 1917, Germany and Austria crushed Italy. In November of 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution occurred in Russia, where the Communist Party took control under Lenin, as depicted here. In March of 1918, Russia signs the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany and drops out of the war. Germany began an all-out assault then on the Western Front. The U.S. rushed troops across the Atlantic, and 2 million American troops were in Europe by November of 1918. Geography as enemy. The critical battle to end the war took place in September of 1918. Allies attacked Germans through the Argonne Forest. The goal was to cut off the German rail supply lines at Sedan. It lasted 47 days. 1.2 million American soldiers pushed toward enemy lines under heavy enemy fire. In 1 month, more ammunition was fired than during the entire Civil War. Many of the infantrymen were black. Black units won awards, yet were segregated from whites, and most blacks were assigned to menial non-combat duties. But you do start seeing more and more black units in the military. All quiet on the Western Front. German lines began crumbling by mid-October of 1918. Americans fought their way and captured the high grounds of Sedan on November 7, 1918. On November 8th, the Germans asked for the Allied terms of armistice. Armistice was signed on November 11, 1918. Next, we will talk about some things that came out of World War I, some of which are still with us today. In May of 1917, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, which required all men between ages 21 and 30 to sign up for military service. This is a notice of this selective service system that was a little bit later. Really had to do with this is a World War II selective service notice, but it really was begun in 1917 to form the draft. And to this day, if young men do not register for the selective service system when they turn 18, they face penalties such as not being able to qualify for student loans through the federally backed student loans. There are certain penalties if they do not register for the draft. Even though we don't have a draft right now, you still have to register in case we were ever needing to have a draft. The War Industry Board regulated the supply of raw materials to manufacturers and the delivery of finished products. So they made sure that raw materials would be used for the war effort if needed. The War Labor Board then handled wages, hours, and working conditions. This had helped ensure the safety of workers during times of warfare when we're trying to ramp up production of materials needed on the front. One of my favorite aspects of World War I was the emergence of victory gardens. As head of the Food Administration, Herbert Hoover asked Americans to conserve food for export and to plant victory gardens. And they started this huge campaign. And if you look at this ad, it says, "Win the war now." And it talks about home canning. Basically what it said was all the food being produced on American farms we should be sending to our troops so that Americans can help support the troops by not buying food at the grocery store like produce. Instead, they should be growing their own victory garden so that they could provide their own produce for their families and that the ones being produced in the farms could be sent to the troops. It was pretty ingenious. Here is another ad from the U.S. government trying to get people to plant victory gardens. Look at this. Plant a garden for victory. They had their own sales slogans. It was the patriotic thing to do to have your own home vegetable garden or your neighborhood victory garden. To save an hour's use of lighting each day, the Fuel Administration established daylight savings time, something we have to this day, right? So you had an extra hour that you could work because you didn't need to use electricity. 2/3 of the war expenditures were paid for by citizens who bought bonds in Liberty loan drives. This is another way you could show your patriotism. You could buy a Liberty loan bond. A U.S. is basically a savings bond. So in effect, you would be loaning the government money to help pay for the war effort in return for interest. So this is how a bond is set up. So these were also extremely popular, both in World War I and World War II, war bonds. The Trading with the Enemy Act gave the Postmaster General, the head of the post office, the right to censor any publications exchanged with foreign countries. The Espionage Act punished anyone found guilty of helping the enemy, hindering recruitment into the armed forces, or inciting revolt or public demonstrations. In the landmark case of Schenck versus the United States, the Supreme Court declared that free speech could be limited if a clear and present danger to the public safety were involved. Basically, Schenck was a man who was trying to convince people to avoid the draft, and he was arrested under the Espionage Act, and said that if you present a clear and present danger to public safety by having people not obey the draft, helping people avoid the draft, you were threatening public safety, and therefore you could be arrested. It was really a dampening of civil liberties, or a repression of civil liberties in the United States during times of war. It happens all the time. Also, the Creel Committee used propaganda to promote the war. So you had all these things coming out. The draft, you have victory gardens, daylight savings time, the oppression of people in terms of their civil liberties, the loss of civil liberties, and their ability for free speech under the Espionage Act and the clear and present danger test. All of these things occurred as a result of World War I. This concludes Part 2 of our guided notes.